How's everybody doing? Today's video is going to be a discussion on what the differences are between the Gibson Les Paul Studio, Standard, and Custom. Now there's obviously minutia, and especially if you count all the previous models over the years of different Les Paul models, probably tens or hundreds of them. But the general three tiers of the Les Paul world are the Studio, the Standard, and the Custom, and those typically never change. So starting with the Gibson Les Paul Studio, these guitars are called Studio because they are more performance focused rather than visual focused, meaning it's supposed to be like a studio tool for you to use rather than something that's real flashy with binding and all kinds of, nicer visual appointments. This is like the workhorse version. So Gibson Les Paul Studio is going to be distinguished by the fact that it has typically just silk screen decals. So there's not an inlaid logo of any sort. It's just a silk screen put onto the headstock veneer, essentially. And they don't have any sort of binding. It's just pure, fretboard, wood on the side, nothing on the side of the body, no binding or anything like that. Just very stripped down visually. Typically, a Les Paul Studio will have a mahogany body, mahogany neck, a maple top, which is a thick top, just like any other Les Paul model, not just I guess technically it's a cap. So it's going to be a thick maple cap rather than just a veneer. And they will typically have a rosewood fretboard, although when they're made in white, they are always given an upgraded fretboard, which would be, in this case, Granadillo on mine, but sometimes they're ebony. But most Les Paul Studio finishes across the board, except for a few like this one, they're all going to have a rosewood fretboard, which is pretty standard, same thing as Les Paul Standard would have, and a ton of other guitars. So considering that the Studio is built as a studio tool, these guitars are actually kind of modern in the sense that they run modern PCB, printed circuit board electronics. So if you opened up the control cavity here, rather than seeing like individual wires being soldered to the potentiometers like you would expect to see in a guitar, you're going to see an actual trapezoid type shaped circuit board that has the pots built into it, that has basically multiple different options for tone configurations. And what that means is, typically you're going to just have coil tapping on a basic level. Most years across the board, as of recent, are going to have coil tapping. Older studios are going to have standard wiring, newer ones are going to have coil tapping, and newer ones are going to especially have PCB electronics like this one has. This is a 2016. So what that basically means is it's going to allow you to configure the switching of the guitar based on push-pull pots for your potentiometers. So rather than just spinning a knob like you have for the volume and tone, you do spin them for volume and tone, but the volume controls for each of these on this Studio are going to be a coil split. If you pull it out, you've now split the neck pickup to a single coil, and you can put it back, or the bridge pickup to a single coil and put it back independently. Now obviously, split humbucker is not going to actually sound nearly as gnarly as a single coil is going to sound, but it's going to get you kind of close or closer than a humbucker would sound. It's going to cut down the output. It's going to give it a little bit more potential for noise, for feedback, and just a little bit more gnarliness. And that's kind of the point of building that wiring into the Les Paul Studio, because it is to be used as a studio tool. I'd also like to say that when I say that something is for a studio tool or for, visually striking or something like that, that doesn't mean that you have to keep this in the studio. Obviously, this guitar is totally fine to play live. It doesn't have any active electronics or anything like that. It just has, a little bit of versatility, great tones actually, and I would play this guitar in any setting. This particular guitar I love. Next, we're moving on to the Gibson Les Paul Standard. Now, in the Curly era, which is the current era of Gibson from 2019 to present, the Gibson Les Paul Standard has been reverted to a standard, meaning they have a standard 50s and a standard 60s option. This particular one is a standard 50s, which keeps it with pretty standard, traditional, to be expected 1950s specs. So basically all except for the fact that this doesn't have hide glue, it has Franklin Tight Bond most likely. But this has very low output 50 specs style pickups. That's another thing I didn't mention on the Studio. The pickups are actually fairly high output, especially for a Les Paul. They're going to give you all the output you could need for arguably any style of music. They're Alnicos. They get really, really hot. It's the 490R, 498T set on the Studio. On the Standard, you move to burst buckers. So on the 50s, you get burst bucker 1 and 2. I believe on the 60s, you get 2 and 3. And then on the Standard 50s, you have a fat 50s style neck, which just basically means that the neck profile is a really round C shape. If you have really big hands, this is going to be super comfortable for you. I love this neck. You know, the neck on a Studio is basically sort of a slim taper or more of a 60s profile. There is a Les Paul Standard 60s that still has that profile, and it's going to give you more of the classic or traditional finishes. As far as the electronics go, on the Les Paul Standard, especially lately, you do not have any fancy electronics at all. You have what they call 1950s wiring for the volume and tone controls. They don't have any coil taps. Personally, as a Les Paul player, even though I used my Studio for years, I very rarely actually coil tapped it. And as somebody who likes a Les Paul for that vibe really, and for the fatness of the humbucker sound, we don't typically like coil taps that much, so it's not totally necessary. And I've said in previous videos that this guitar really covers all the range of tones that you would need out of a Les Paul in particular, so they're not really missed. It's just got standard traditional wiring as it was originally devised. Also, going from the Studio to the Standard, you are going to get an increased suite of visual appointments from Gibson. And this is, you know, on a lot of like Eastern guitars like Schecters and LTDs and things like that, it's not that big of a deal to put on binding and even like really sort of ornate looking binding. But those are set in more of a modern way, whereas Gibson uses a very traditional style of actually applying their binding, which is carried over from when Orville Gibson was making mandolins and really sort of ornate instruments. And it's really cool. If you ever see the process of how they do that, there's videos on YouTube to check that out. So whereas the Studio had no binding at all, just to sort of save cost, the Standard, being the next level in cost, has single ply binding down the neck, as you can see. They do something that's hard to catch on camera, but Gibson does what's called a fret nib binding. So the fret is actually cut short and the fret metal is replaced with a binding end. So this strip of binding is basically including the shape of the end of what the fret would be. So that's a really cool sort of classic ornate touch that they do, as well as you have single ply binding around the body of a Les Paul Standard, no matter what model you get. And as of late, the Standards come with traditional color options. So you basically have like a cherry sunburst, this one being a gold top, one of the earliest color options. I absolutely love this classic appointment. You also have a vintage sunburst, like a tobacco sunburst, one they call unburst, which is like a very sun-faded version of a sunburst. So a lot of those finishes will actually let you see the maple top and the wood grain pattern show through. I personally don't really put a lot of value in that. I just prefer more solid colors. That's kind of an odd preference, but that's just my own preference. So this has a maple cap, same as like a Studio does or any Les Paul would do, most any Les Paul, but it's just painted over as a gold top, which is just, I think, is cooler than wood grain. That's just sort of more classic, more cool. You know, you get the classic style tuners, although the Gibson Deluxe style tuners are the same on my Studio. And the other thing visually that you get is on the headstock, you'll notice, whereas the Studio just had a silk screen applied, the Standard actually has an inlaid Gibson logo that is mother of pearl. So it's like actually it might be an abalone inlay. It looks different than how the fretboard inlays are. If you notice, it's a little bit more blue to it. So it's a nicer logo that you get on the standard, just nicer visual appointments with the binding. As far as body depth, the Studio and the standard are very close in terms of body thickness. They might be slightly different, but they seem very close to me. One more thing I forgot to mention, the Studio has what's called modern weight relief. So it has like chambers taken out of the body where there's air to make it lighter weight, whereas the standard in the current era is non-weight relieved. So this guitar has an absolutely solid body. So there's no chambering in it. It's just solid wood. It's quite heavy. It's heavier than the Studio, and it's just now, especially in recent years, it is the standard Les Paul. And truthfully, it's really all that you need out of a Les Paul. You know, you've got a rosewood fretboard and everything that's just really nice, really playable, feels great. It's just a little bit more classic or traditional or standard, as the name would imply. And I should note that in all those comments that I made about the in the curly era as of late from 2019 until present, that basically is referring to the fact that the previous era of Gibson used the Les Paul standard model to innovate, especially in the last few years of the previous CEO. They had a lot of drastically different features that they would roll out on the standard. The prices of the standard became very high. The finishes became really cool, but very modern and sort of unusual, not what the purists wanted. So in the end, in the past, like, I would say from 2018 back to about 2008, you really didn't know, there wasn't a standard of what to expect for features. So you would probably have to do some digging and some research to understand the little minute differences as to which model for each model year that you were buying. But as of 2019 forward with James Curley, they have basically standardized the standard, which I think is probably a good move. And last but not least, we have the Les Paul Custom. So the Studio is the lowest tier in this, and then you move up to standard, and then you move up to custom. So whereas the standard had some improved visual appointments, you know, single ply binding, the custom, you'll notice right away, has like triple or 5-layer binding where it goes black to white to black to white to black. It has neck binding. It has multiple layers of binding around the headstock. It has abalone inlays on the headstock logo, the emblem, which replaces the Les Paul silkscreen in the middle of the headstock. And then all the actual fretboard inlays are abalone. You end up with the gold hardware. You get binding on the back of the guitar, which, again, I mean, if you think about binding as like some of the, you know, non-traditional ways of applying it, it's not that impressive. But when you realize what Gibson does to put the binding on to these, it becomes very impressive, very labor intensive, really cool, and it achieves a nice sort of outlining effect where the guitar, whether it's black or white, in this case on custom, can be clearly seen and sort of outlined against its surroundings. You know, you can play this guitar with jeans, in a suit, in a tuxedo. I mean, you're not going to ever look out of place. So an interesting fact, and why I did a previous tone comparison between the Gibson Les Paul Studio and Custom, if you haven't seen that already, go check it out, is that the Studio and the Custom have the same set of pickups, which is the Gibson 490R 498T hot Alnico pickups. These are very warm sounding, very high output, or fairly high output. I mean, when you're talking about a Les Paul, you're talking about a guitar that has a tremendous roaring sort of natural resonance to it already. So a Les Paul, even with weak pickups, if you've seen my Les Paul standard tone demo, you'll realize that that guitar is still very like bellowing, roaring, and full of harmonics. That's the case with pretty much any Gibson Les Paul, which is why I love Gibson. But that guitar has weak pickups and it still achieves that. This guitar, as well as the Studio, have hotter pickups. They're not the hottest in the world, but they're pretty hot. So this will do anything you ask it to as far as genre. You can tone it down and play jazz. You can turn it up and just shred like crazy. You never have to worry about running out of power, running out of breath with this thing. And the difference when you rise to the custom is you go from, whereas most studios and standards will have a rosewood fretboard, you end up with an ebony fretboard on the custom. And this is true African ebony that they really go to great lengths to procure this wood, and it sounds and feels amazing to play. This guitar, as far as the fretwork goes, is on another level entirely from anything else. And the way that the pricing goes, if you begin with a studio at a decent price, you basically double the price to get to a standard, and then you double it again to get to a custom. So these guitars are pretty expensive, but they are the nicest guitars, in my opinion, that you are ever going to find. One more thing, in addition to the 490 series pickups that the studio has, you will notice that the custom has no fancy electronics because the custom is basically 1950s wiring, the same as the standard 50s that I have. So Gibson has decided that the ultimate wiring for a Les Paul is the 1950s style wiring that they give to the 50s and 60s standard and the custom, and you don't need coil taps, which if you're a Les Paul player, you're probably not going to be inclined to use anyway, so they don't bother with it. So this thing is just a solid, very, very high quality potentiometers. I mean, there's like huge nuts and washers under these bolts. It's just very like industrial strength stuff that, you know, you're never going to wear out on a guitar like this. I mean, it's going to take you probably decades of heavy use to wear out any switch or potentiometer knob or anything like that if you're using these guitars regularly. They're super, super nice, high quality stuff. And with that being said, every level of Gibson USA guitar does have a nitrocellulose lacquer finish, so you're not going to sacrifice on the feel and the breathability and the resonance and the unrestricted tones and harmonics coming out of any of these models, including the Studio. They all have nitro finishes. They're all super well appointed finishes, even though they might have visually stripped down, medium, and fancy looking visual appointments. They all are going to sound amazing. Another point I forgot to mention about the custom is that the custom is built in a different facility. It's built in the custom shop, whereas most Gibson USA models are built in the standard Nashville Gibson USA plant. The custom is also built in Nashville, but it's built in its own separate shop. So it's a totally different line, totally different level of skill of luthiers that are building it, as well as a different process. So you have, I believe, a much more personal investment by each luthier in the process of building a custom versus a Gibson USA, which is much more assembly line, point to point. You have an expert in each place, but they don't really each have a particular huge investment in that instrument, whereas in the custom they do. So there you go, guys. I tried to make that fairly quick as far as just going through the talking points. I'm going to continue to do sound comparisons. I've already done the studio versus custom sound comparison, which I think is interesting because they have the same pickups. Check that out if you haven't already. It's a few videos back for me. I've also done the sound demo of the standard just by itself. I'm going to next probably do the studio versus the standard, and then the standard versus the custom sound comparison. I don't really have a schedule for that, but I think those are probably due out sometime in the near future. If you want to see that type of thing, click subscribe, turn on the notifications to all. If you like this video, don't forget to share it, and I will see you guys next time.